Hi, I'm a fat little Asian man, and welcome to the Korean peninsula. Here you can meet the two brothers, North and South Korea. You'd think that sharing the same country for around 1,000 years would make them quite similar, right? Nope, one's rich and one's poor, one has depression and the other has anger issues. One loves skinny boys dancing, while one loves a weirdly round middle-aged man. But perhaps the most different is that both Koreas evolved into two seemingly unique dystopias. One's a late-stage capitalist cyberpunk dystopia, and one's a 1984-esque Big Brother totalitarian dystopia. Yup, Korea really did just speedrun two dystopias in only around 50 years or so, completely unrecognizable from each other. The history of the PTSD-riddled social experiment that is the Korean peninsula won't be easy to explain, but join me on how polar opposite dystopias developed in the Korean peninsula. I suppose I should start by introducing my place first. This is South Korea. Just look at all the cyberpunk sites of Seoul, where efficiency is king. We've got the fastest internet, Korean fried chicken with 24-hour delivery, and a vast and on-time subway system. You can walk through the neon-lit streets filled with shopping malls, cafe bakeries, norebangs, and tasty restaurants, until you realize there aren't any kids on the street. Schools are closing, and playgrounds are filling up with the elderly. But we're still hopeful for our birth rate increasing from 0.7 to what's the difference 0.8 over the past 2 years. Kind of dark, right? It's how you know South Korea is on the trajectory to become the next cyberpunk installment, where society is controlled completely by mega corporations. Our own little twist on mega corporations are called chaebols. Literally meaning rich family in Korean, they're massive family-run conglomerates with huge political leverage and economic influence over the country. Don't be surprised, remember that our surrogate father is run by and so being run by chaebols doesn't feel as bad. It is entirely possible to be born in a Samsung hospital, live in a Samsung built apartment with Samsung appliances, go to a Samsung affiliated university, and also work for Samsung your entire life. But as a Samsung brain chip installed Korean, living in such a chaebol dominated life is not the main reason why South Korea is a dystopia. It's the ever-present idea that results completely justify the means. Even though keeping up the chaebol system makes Korea the most highly educated, over-caffeinated, and sleep-deprived workforce, it's okay to keep the society hyper-competitive with suppressed labor rights and widespread societal burnout. If maximizing chaebol's shareholder value is what brings the country and the people up the economic and social ladder, everything's fine. At the end of the day, just distract them with K-dramas about marrying a chaebol heir, shows with hot people doing romance for you instead, and trends that seem to change every week. However, failure to function in the system is all on you. You weren't good enough for the system, which, of course, couldn't possibly have any problems. Probably why South Korea not only has the least amount of new players, it has the most logouts as well. While South Korea's bright neon lights distract you from the searing problems of society, our neighbors in the north prefer a more vintage approach to dystopias. Instead of flashy idols, there's Kim Jong-un's latest encouragement speech. There are no 12-hour study sessions, but there is a mandatory 10-year minimum military service. And unlike the South, kids are actually being born in the North, but instead of grinding away in schools, these children face the reality of public executions just for watching illegally smuggled South Korean dramas. So yeah, that's pretty dark too. Being executed for watching Gongyu might feel like a bit of a stretch, but that's just the Big Brother style used by North Korea. Unlike the efficiency and progress used to legitimize corporate rule in South Korea, the main focus in the North Korean totalitarian dystopia is about control, survival, and fear. The absolute control has been given to the Kim family for 3, potentially 4 generations now. Kim Jong-un and his extension, the Workers' Party of Korea, dictate the rules of the country. Everything from your haircut to your social status, and most importantly, information and narrative. Going against the party-set narrative can get you and your 3 generations sent to political prison camps. Listening to North Korean state media is exactly like talking to a self-described internet communist who calls everything CIA propaganda the second they don't agree with it. The South Korean counterpart, by the way, is the K-pop stan that acts all high and mighty because they've got a bigger camera lens than you. So pick your poison. North Korea isn't a dystopia just because the Kim family stays wealthy off the suffering of the people. That's just kind of the world we live in. It's a dystopia because you don't have a choice but to comply with this narrative. North Koreans aren't brainwashed idiots. they know that massive inequality, impoverishment, and corruption exists in their country. They just can't say anything about it. Getting the death penalty for watching Stairway to Heaven or becoming a meat shield in the Ukraine war for the sake of the supreme leader. Your rights as an individual don't matter at all. It's why North Korean names all have to be revolutionary, like Exploding Kang or Iron Kim, to remind you, you always exist for the country. Hearing these descriptions makes it seem like both Koreas are equally dramatic dystopias. But it's not so simple. No matter what self-proclaimed American commies sipping matcha lattes in Starbucks on their MacBooks have to say, North Korea is a systemic human rights crisis run by a brutal dictatorship. But it's also a place where real people live and adapt. Everyone there knows about the societal flaws, but they need to survive day to day. And just like how the people had to adapt, the story of both Koreas isn't just a simple capitalism versus communism. They are the result of extreme historical realities forced upon the exact same people, which is what we're going to look at right now. Let's start at a period when the peninsula was divided into not 2, but 3 countries, the Three Kingdoms period. Baekje, Sinla, and Goguryeo all kinda competed with each other to take control over the peninsula. Already you can see that Goguryeo was on a different level. As even Chinese emperors with massive armies all failed to defeat Goguryeo, it was clear they needed a different approach. So the Tang dynasty struck a deal with Sinla to help defeat Sinla's mortal rival Baekje if they helped them defeat Goguryeo. And that's how Sinla unified the Three Kingdoms. The history between northern and southern Koreans kinda begins here. Sinla tried to claim everyone had equal rights, but power naturally centered around Sinla elites. It was clear integration policies had failed because unified Sinla shattered and was later reunified again by Goryeo, the spiritual successor to Goguryeo. Things only got worse during the Joseon dynasty, which replaced Goryeo. Because of legitimacy, Joseon needed to distance themselves from Goryeo as much as they could, mostly by using the prejudice of northern provinces for mingling with barbaric tribes. They made a clear discrimination between elites of the north and south. So instead of Confucianism, the northern provinces adopted capitalism. Pyongyang was a massive trade hub with China, so they used all that trade money as power against the snobby Seoul political elites. It's also why when Western missionaries showed up, Pyongyang was nicknamed the Jerusalem of the East for how widely people embraced Christianity. Also ironically, the southern provinces had a bit of an underground communist movement. Unlike how the rugged mountainous northern provinces chose commerce and trade, the southern provinces were flat and fertile, perfect for ultra-wealthy traditional landlords to exploit poor tenant farmers. It was kind of the perfect place for communism to appeal to the general public. Communism was also popular as a form of resistance, especially as Japanese collaborated with such wealthy landlords to colonize Korea and crack down on the people. It's why not only was the original Communist Party of Korea created in Seoul, but moments after gaining independence from the Japanese, grassroots socialist groups appeared all over the southern provinces to take over local governance. A little strange considering the situation with the current day Koreas, right? Korea endured decades of the Japanese attempting to erase the language, culture, and identity, something resisted by everybody, communist and capitalist alike. When independence rolled around, everybody was supposed to come together to decide how to form the new government. However, Korea was robbed of that decision when the United States and the Soviet Union swooped in like two divorced parents trying to fight over custody of a kid they found out 5 seconds ago. This direct interference made thousands of years of history and context almost meaningless. And we already know what good crossing arbitrary borders does in parts of the world. And that's exactly how Pyongyang, the most Christian and capitalist city on the entire peninsula, was taken over by atheist and communist Soviets, while Seoul, capital of class conflicts, tradition, and elitist gatekeeping, was handed over to hyper-capitalist melting pot Americans. Initially, the divide was supposed to be temporary. Both the Soviets or Americans didn't really want to stay here either. The Korean people also had hope. There was still that feeling of family, one people, one country, waiting to be reunited. Something that would all disappear really soon because 5 years was just too long for North Korea. The Soviet Union and China helped support the North Korean army, giving it the firepower it needed to wipe out the weak and unprepared South Korean forces. Meanwhile, South Korea got support from the US, which did what they do best, dropping bombs. They dropped so much bombs, in fact, they used more bombs in the Korean War than they did on Japan during World War II. By the end of it all, the peninsula was up in flames. People who just a few months ago were family and nation had just slaughtered each other. Both Koreas were so insanely traumatized, the sentiment of one people fighting against the Japanese was quickly buried under all the rubble. The PTSD from the Korean War really set the trajectory for both Koreas to become their own unique dystopias. Initially, the US and the Soviet Union were only liked by a few elites who needed their muscle to stay in power. In the public's eyes though, they were both just new management replacing the Japanese, a perspective that the war completely changed. Both Koreas experienced being pushed to the absolute brink of defeat, only to be saved at the last second by their respective superpower. Suddenly, the US and the Soviets became the heroes protecting them from total defeat. Each Korea trauma bonded with their new surrogate father figures, while an intense hatred grew for the other. At this point, it was no longer an ideological debate about which system to run the country with. The people who wanted to have that debate had already been assassinated, bombed 6 feet under, or had run away abroad. The only point left was surviving, which you didn't do with communism or capitalism, you did it by looking at your newfound saviors. Also, peace wasn't expected to last. It was, and still is, just a ceasefire after all. If they wanted to develop, they needed to do it faster than the other Korea. This emphasis on speed made each Korea's transformation radical and extreme, all based on their newly found idols. Opposition was just going to slow things down. They were obstacles that needed to disappear. After the war, both countries went straight into dictatorships backed by their respective global dads. Yes, Kim Il-sung and his family are world-renowned, but South Korea didn't slack off in the dictatorship department either. It starts off with this guy, Seungman Rhee. He was an American-educated, English-fluent independence activist, but most importantly, he hated communists, which was basically the only quality needed to be a US-backed dictator back then. Very much in character, he spent most of his regime violently cracking down on any hint of communism or socialism just to get more US funds, mainly so he could pocket them and idolize himself. Eventually, he was kicked out by massive nationwide student protests against corruption and election fraud. It's not like he didn't try to change things, but one thing was certain. Just being a US-backed anti-communist wasn't going to achieve anything. South Korea needed money, especially after the US pulled aid due to Rhee's corruption. Unlike North Korea, there were no natural resources, no heavy industries, and no infrastructure. During colonization, the Japanese had built all the factories up north to refine minerals, and only used the south to grow crops. So when the peninsula was split, South Korea had nothing left to make money, except for human hair to make wigs. Seriously. Against a richer, heavily armed North Korea, South Korea stood no chance. A strong economy was vital to funding a strong military. This is exactly what Park Chung-hee had in mind. He picked the US economy as a point of reference, but since America was 10,000 kilometers away, he used the next closest thing, Japan. Because South Korea was modeled on Korea's interpretation of Japan's interpretation of American capitalism, it was fated to be extra extreme. Plus, Park was kind of a massive Japan fanboy, especially regarding their rapid economic growth. That's probably why he pushed so hard for Japan's manufacturing export model. His first move was to copy the Japanese Zaibatsu, the OG chaebols. He handpicked a few loyal, ambitious, and capable families, gave them massive government subsidies, and shielded them from foreign competitors. In return for this blank check, they had to build his industrial empire at all costs. The problem was the foundation South Korea's economy was built on. While the chaebols were still figuring shit out, Park desperately needed money to rebuild highways and factories. So he decided to export the one thing South Korea actually had: people. He sent thousands of Korean nurses and miners to work in Germany in exchange for foreign loans. Likewise, South Korea deployed massive amounts of troops to the Vietnam War for US financial and military aid. The idea of literally sacrificing people for economic growth solidified. To keep export prices cheap and growth moving, labor rights were basically non-existent. Society was turned into an absolute meat grinder, all driven by one trauma-induced logic: lock-in twin or commies are gonna kill us, which the constant border skirmishes and assassination attempts didn't really help. While South Korea was busy min-maxing their economy, North Korea was busy doing exactly the same thing. But from the start, the North had some big advantages. Natural resources, yes, but also proximity to their sugar daddies. Unlike US aid, which was basically just surplus food that put local farmers out of business while corrupt elites pocketed the cash, Soviet aid was kind of practical. They had the entire Eastern Bloc send engineers, blueprints, and heavy equipment to rebuild the industries and infrastructure the US had bombed down to ash. But even with literal factories being mailed to them piece by piece, people still had to physically put it all together. Just like South Korea's meat grinder work culture, the North had the Cheonlima movement. It was exactly the same trauma-induced logic. Build dams and factories as fast as humanly possible to not get bombed by the Americans again. It didn't help that North Korea was going through a massive ideological crisis at the same time. Kim Il-sung loved Stalinism, and follows Stalin's brutal policies and cult of personality tactics to the bone. However, when Stalin died and the Soviet Union started its de-Stalinization, Kim realized he was also susceptible to having his entire legacy erased and replaced with a more compliant puppet. So, while the Soviets and the Chinese were distracted fighting each other during the Sino-Soviet split, Kim saw his chance to purge any pro-Soviet or pro-Chinese factions from his government. They were actively trying to get rid of him too. These events would make Kim more paranoid, convinced that his regime would only survive by isolating it from outside political influences. To lock the country down, he replaced orthodox communism with a hyper-nationalist, isolationist ideology called Juche, then took control of the information and did a few more purges here and there. Next, he rolled out the Seongbun system, which is basically the social credit system but based on how loyal your bloodline was to the Kim family. This obsession with loyalty completely broke their economic progress. Unlike South Korea, where chaebols needed to innovate and expand using actual business expertise, North Korean industries and farms were handed over to loyal party officials who didn't really know shit about how impossible their quotas were. But on the outside, the economy was okay, because Kim had access to the communist GoFundMe, basically milking both Soviets and China for endless streams of food, oil, and equipment, just by threatening to side with the other guy. For a couple of decades, it genuinely looked like North Korea's strategy was working. But by the late 1970s, North Korea basically hit the limit of their build. You can only force people to mine so much materials, but it's not going to help you know what to do with them. Meanwhile, South Korea's chaebols finally started to expand into global markets. They stopped exporting real hair wigs, thank God, and started competing in global electronics, retail, and cars. And when they finally got to show off their progress to the world in the '88 Seoul Olympics, it seemed like South Korea would get the happily ever after it thought it deserved. However, the chaebols had been taking out insane amounts of debt to grow so fast. In 1997, that economic bubble exploded, bankrupting the country overnight. The only way to survive was a massive bailout from the IMF. The sudden forced application of a Western free market to an already young and unstable economy changed the Korean landscape drastically. All this was basically enough to finish South Korea's dystopia. Before the IMF, the deal was simple. Work yourself to near death for the company, and the company will employ you for life. Strong government control kept the chaebols from crossing certain lines, while the people had successfully gone from living in straw huts to concrete apartments. But after the IMF, companies went bankrupt, millions were laid off, and death rates skyrocketed. Now it's just work yourself to near death for the company, period. Plus, most small to medium businesses went under during the financial crisis, giving the chaebols that survived even more concentrated power. It all created the hyper-insecure and economic ladder-obsessed society that is South Korea today. North Korea wasn't having such a good time either. Global oil shocks made North Korea's debt sky high, and their attempted trade with Eastern Europe failed. China went and reformed, opening diplomatic relations with the US and using dollars for international trade, effectively dismantling a large portion of trade with North Korea. Also, just when Kim Il-sung needed them the most, the Soviet Union collapsed. With their trusted GoFundMe disappearing overnight, North Korea was left with no food, no oil, and no trading partners, leading to the Great Famine of the 90s. For Kim Jong-il though, the famine exposed loose ends in his control. Starving people can't work, unless you force them to by concentrating the few resources left to the military, so you can gun down any opposition. Kim Jong-il's military-first policy peaked when he started testing nuclear weapons. Seemed like a puzzling choice considering both the US and South Korea were literally in their sunshine era, actively sending aid and trying to be more friendly. But every nuclear test resulted in, of course, more sanctions from everyone, conveniently isolating citizens inside while guaranteeing no foreign power could intervene. Things have changed a lot since then, but certain fundamentals remain. North Korea is no longer the super famished country it once was, ever since Kim Jong-un attempted to reel back his father's military-first policy. But everything still remains tightly under his control. South Korea's economy has recovered since the IMF crisis, and now we make better phones and cars, but it still sees humans as replaceable assets. Of course, when we only look at countries purely as systems or economies, we completely erase the actual human beings inside them. From a brief look, South Korea should also be a society controlled by chaebols, just like how the Kim family controls North Korea. But this ignores possibly what I think is the most important part of our history. The people fought back. Koreans never just lied down and accepted the dystopian reality. Every time a US-backed dictator crossed a line, the people literally bled to push them back. Even in 2024, South Koreans rose up against a martial law attempt as well. It's a story of how people continuously refuse to let the system crush their own humanity, which is why North Korea is even more tragic. When the US and Soviets drew an arbitrary line across the map in 1945, they didn't just divide a piece of land, they took a single unified people who had just survived decades of brutal colonization and made it a geopolitical science experiment. They forcibly swapped the servers and installed two completely alien extreme operating systems. Both sides were traumatized, both sides were pushed to the absolute brink of annihilation, and both sides adapted to the extremes. The story of North and South Korea isn't just a story about the ultimate clash between communism and capitalism that you think it is. It is a tragic lesson in what happens when global superpowers force a traumatized people to speedrun survival. Thank you for watching, by the way. If you want more videos like this, you know where to find me. I make these videos by myself and I don't use AI, which you can probably tell from how my video looks and sounds different from AI channels. So it would be a big help if you subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. Here's some other content that you may like.